Okay, we're going to begin. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Bergman. I'm the president of World Class Productivity. Welcome to this one-hour webinar on Agile Transformation. The speaker for this session is Kieran Bondale. Kieran is a senior project management trainer and consultant with almost 20 years experience in both traditional and Agile project management. In addition to having his project management professional, risk management professional, and Agile certified practitioner designations from the Project Management Institute, Kieran has also obtained his certified disciplined Agile practitioner and certified disciplined Agile instructor credentials from the Disciplined Agile Consortium. Over the past decade, Kieran has trained hundreds of professionals on a variety of project management topics and is frequently asked to speak at project management conferences. Kieran also maintains a weekly blog that ranks as one of the top 50 project management blogs on the internet. So without further ado, please welcome Kieran.
Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. The topic for today's webinar is your Agile transformation an Autobot or a Decepticon? Now, for those of you that are not like me, fans of Michael Bay's over-the-top movies, you might not be familiar with these references, so let me clue you in. The Autobots and the Decepticons are two races of alien robots that are part of the Transformers universe. So to kick things off, I'm going to go ahead and show our first Autobot, namely their leader, Optimus Prime. And there's going to be a few more references to the Autobots and the Decepticons through this presentation. The rationale behind using this metaphor was that we're talking about Agile transformation, and so I thought it was a very easy step to then look at the Transformers. So the agenda, what are we going to be touching on? Well, we're going to be starting by doing a bit of an Agile refresher. I'm sure many of you have a significant amount of experience with Agile delivery, but there's likely some of you for whom this is still fairly new. So I want to make sure that we've got a basic, solid, consistent foundation of knowledge before we jump into the main topic of Agile transformation. From there, I want to really discuss what is an Agile transformation because, again, that's a term that may not be familiar to some of you, and I want to really contrast it with what you would see as far as using Agile practices on a single project. It is a very different beast, if you will. That's where we're going to jump into the core of the presentation, which looks at our Autobots and Decepticons. Now, again, for those of you not familiar with the Transformers universe, the Autobots are the good guys, the Decepticons are the bad robots. I'm briefly going to touch on Agile scaling frameworks because when we talk about Agile transformation, it's very difficult to take basic Agile principles and values and methodologies such as Scrum and apply them to a large project or a large enterprise. That's where Agile scaling frameworks have been designed to step in and be able to help you be able to apply Agile on a broader or larger scale. And then finally, we're going to close out with a slide looking at how might you get started. So if maybe you're planning an Agile transformation or you're thinking about getting started with one, I want to give you a few ideas on how that might begin. So before we start the Agile refresher, what I'd like to do is to do our first poll. And this is going to be looking at rating your Agile knowledge. So hopefully on your side, you're seeing a little pop-up that has 4 choices that will enable you to rate your Agile knowledge. So please go ahead and provide your information. And I'm going to give it a little bit of time to stabilize. We've got about 42 folks on the line. So once we get to about 75% of that audience, I think we'll have a steady state. Okay, so we've got about 35 out of the 42 folks that are on the line have voted. So I'm going to go ahead and end the polling at this point and go ahead and share the results with you. So what you can see is that out of our audience, I'd say a slim majority have got some awareness of Agile, either taken a course or potentially been a team member on an Agile project. We've got then the runner-up being folks for whom Agile is fairly new. And then we've got a minority, about just over 10% of people that are quite competent, folks that have led multiple Agile projects. So definitely folks on the higher end of the capability spectrum when it comes to Agile. And thankfully for me, there's nobody on the line that's actually signed the Manifesto for Agile Software Development because I probably want to promote them to be a panelist and take you through the remainder of the materials. So let's get started with this now. Let me close off our polls and get into then the Agile refresher. So what is Agile? Agile really is a set of values and principles that can be codified into an approach to enable organizations and teams to deliver business value early and regularly. And Agile, even though we tend to think about it as having started in the software development space, if you sort of scratch the cover of Agile, under the covers what you have is lean and other quality principles. So the real values that we look at there is ensuring we're delivering what our customers want, when they want it, and build on what they want regularly. So they're not waiting a long time to realize value for their project investments. Now, Agile delivery, even though, again, as I said, the original manifesto for Agile Software Development was focused on technology scope projects, Agile delivery itself could be applied to almost any type of project. And in fact, PMI has done some research recently and shown that there's almost no industry out there where Agile principles have not been utilized. Now, when we take a look at Agile methodologies, such as Scrum or extreme programming, those might lend themselves to a specific domain of projects, but Agile delivery and applying specific practices and the values and principles of Agile could be applied to almost any type of project. Now, it's important to note that since 2001, Agile has gone through a few waves, I would say. There's been the wave of Agile is the greatest thing since sliced bread to Agile doesn't work. Now we're into the scaled Agile is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I'm sure at some point somebody's going to stand up and say, well, scaled Agile doesn't work. The reality is that like any type of framework or platform or set of principles, it's not a silver bullet. So what are the kinds of things that Agile cannot make up for? Well, Agile is not going to make up for poor organizational maturity when it comes to portfolio management or project management. So if there isn't organizational support for efficient, effective delivery of projects, well, Agile isn't necessarily going to fix that. Agile is also not going to be a substitute for starting too many projects. If we're starting too many projects and we don't have the resources to deliver them, Agile is not somehow going to magically solve that problem. Agile is also not going to help us deal with legacy constraints. So if we happen to be operating in an environment where we have a tremendous percentage of legacy applications, legacy systems, and those would, let's say, cripple the ability either using a traditional approach or an Agile approach to deliver value in a quick fashion or in a more rapid fashion, well, Agile is not going to magically solve that either. So while Agile can certainly help an organization move from a big bang to more of an early and a regular delivery approach, in and of itself, it's not going to be a silver bullet. So when we talk about an Agile transformation, before I get into the description of it, I've got one more poll that maybe we can go through. So this poll is going to ask all of our audience, how far along are you in your Agile transformation at your companies? And as before, I'll give it a couple of minutes to stabilize. Okay, let's take a look at how our audience has answered. So what we're seeing is that for the majority of folks, they are just getting started. And our runner-up is attendees that are working for companies that at the moment don't have any specific plans to transform their organization's delivery to an Agile approach. We've got a few folks, about a fifth, that are a year or two into their transformation. And again, we've got about just over 10% that have been at it for more than 2 years. And the number is actually quite kind of interesting because it's exactly the same number of the folks that were that expressed that they were at a higher level of Agile maturity. So likely I'd say some sort of a correlation there. Okay, so what do we mean by an Agile transformation? First of all, the two pretty pictures that you've got in front of you. At the very top, we have the leader of the Decepticons, Megatron. At the bottom, we have Optimus Prime in his, I would say, hidden mode of being a tractor trailer. But what is an Agile transformation? When we use that term, what do we mean? Is it taking our delivery practices from a traditional to an Agile delivery approach, or going from a department or enterprise portfolio level, so essentially moving from using Agile on maybe 1 or 2 projects to moving it up to the majority of projects in our department or the majority of projects across our enterprise portfolio? Maybe. How about this? Maybe an agile transformation is moving us from a project-centric way of delivering value to something that is more product-centric. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we move through the remaining slides in the deck. Or potentially, maybe it's looking more from a portfolio management perspective. Is it looking at only starting as many projects as we can start at a given point in time based on our availability of resources? So maybe it's really getting better at cutting our code according to our cloth, as it were. Or finally, is an agile transformation breaking down the walls between development? And when I use the term development, I'm using it broadly, not just software development, but any type of product development and our operations, our business as usual kind of state. Is it about breaking down the walls? Well, as it turns out, it's actually all of the above. An agile transformation is really talking about all of these things. Certainly, I don't view this as being a destination. It is more of a journey. So it could be that for your organizations, the first step on your journey might be only one of these bullets. But at some point in time, if you're truly going to leverage or exploit, I would say, the value out of your agile transformation, you're going to want to go across all four of these. Okay. So let's now start to look at the two different approaches you could take to an agile transformation. And we're going to start off with what I call the Autobot path. This would be what I would recommend as the way to do it. I would spend a significant amount of effort focusing on influencing and evolving the mindset within your organization. If there's one message I want to impart to you during this webinar that you remember, it's that true agility is mindset and behavior first. Then practices, tools, techniques, methodologies, all of those come along later on. But it all starts with mindset. And a lot of the effort needs to be spent there. If people are thinking in an agile manner, they're likely to be agile. Now, once we have the right mindset, which often can take 1 or 2 years to set in, then you start to see the behavior matching that mindset. Malcolm Gladwell famously provided the 10,000 hours metric for how long you need to practice a different practice before it becomes second nature. I would look at mindset that way. 10,000 hours of thinking in a different way will then start to build a muscle memory so that your behavior becomes agile. From there, we can now introduce practices. When I'm referring to practices, what I'm talking about is things like how we would go about delivering a project in an agile manner. Still a lot of flexibility being provided to practitioners. Individual project teams might do things in a different way, but we're starting to move now towards more of a consistent playbook. And then the last area I would focus on is around tools and methodology. Tools, of course, being the Agile software solutions that can support delivery and collaboration, and methodology being that combined set of practices, artifacts, governance, guidelines, all of that stuff. That is what I consider to be our methodologies. So again, you can see, start off with mindset, then when that mindset is right, progress into behavior, from behavior to practices, from practices to tools and methodology. Now, on the other hand, if, like many organizations, you choose to follow the Decepticon approach, what that's going to look like is something like this. You're going to start off by investing a tremendous amount of effort and financial resources in implementing methodology and tools. You'll bring in some of the large consulting firms to custom create a methodology for you. You're going to go to some of the tier 1 tools companies that are out there, like Atlassian or Version 1, buy their tool suites. Over time, as you roll those out, you'll recognize that there's inconsistency. Different agile teams are doing things in different ways. So you'll start to focus on practices. But for some reason, value isn't still being delivered as early or as regularly as you'd want, and your team morale and team engagement hasn't increased as much as you would like to see. That's where you realize the problem might be really about behavior. So you might spend a little bit of time trying to encourage people to mirror the right types of behavior. And finally, the penny will drop and you'll realize that mindset was what you needed to focus on from the get-go. Unfortunately, taking the Decepticon approach might take you a couple of years before you turn the corner and really start to see value out of your Agile transformation. So let's start to do a bit more of a deep dive into our Decepticons, our individual bad guys for an Agile transformation. Let me start off with the first one, and this ties very much to the inverted pyramid from the previous slide. This is about doing Agile instead of being Agile. Agile, as I said, is a mindset. I can be Agile when I'm surrounded by waterfall constraints, and we will still deliver value to our customer in an agreed upon timeline with a high degree of team motivation. On the other hand, if I'm doing Agile, we might be using all the ceremonies of Agile. We might be having daily stand-ups. We might be doing retrospectives. We might structure our project into sprints or iterations, and yet we don't see the value. One of the phrases or one of the terms that's used to describe this is cargo cult. And you can look that one up on Wikipedia if you want to get more information about what that term means. Here's another one. We have Agile practices out there in the field, but behavior is still reflecting theory X. We're still showing that lack of collaboration and respect for our team members. We're still in that mindset where our role as sponsors or as senior leaders or project managers is command and control versus taking that servant leadership mindset that Robert Greenleaf had talked about 60 years ago and setting ourselves up to remove the roadblocks from the path of our team, being the servant first to be a better leader. In many large organizations that might be willing to go or wanting to go through an Agile transformation, they're faced with this challenge of inefficient or diffused decision making. There might be multiple silos where each silo having a chief, and until all of those chiefs have said that they agree with a particular requirement, the team isn't able to start development work. You might have a role on your project called a product owner, but if that product owner has to check their prioritization of requirements in the backlog against 15 senior managers, that isn't Agile. Many of the companies I've worked with have introduced Agile practices, but they're still having their staff do the same volume of work they were doing before. Multitasking is not good in any type of delivery approach. It's bad on waterfall, but it's absolutely lethal on Agile. Agile is based on a fundamental principle that we work together as a team and we can share information in a more lightweight fashion without having to rely on heavy onerous artifacts because everyone is there. But if we cannot have a predictable estimate as to our resource availability, then we find ourselves in a situation where Bob has walked out of the room to work on that other project, and by the time Bob comes back in the room, he's missed a critical piece of information. And now we're incurring, to use the lean phrase, we're incurring waste to be able to bring Bob up to speed. Even worse, Bob might not actually have the foresight or the proactivity to ask us, what have I missed? He may just plunk down at his computer and start typing away, and he may have missed a significant change that affected one of the work items or requirements that he was working on. Now we're potentially looking at defects being introduced because Bob wasn't in the room. On top of that, one of the metrics that's used to judge progress and to enable forecasting on an Agile project is known as velocity. It's very difficult to get a stable velocity that you can rely on to do accurate forecasting if you have folks that are not at a predictable percentage allocation to your Agile teams. So multitasking is just bad news. And this is, again, where I go back to the importance of focusing on mindset and behavior. A lot of effort needs to be spent with senior leaders to help them understand that it is better to do a fewer number of projects, complete them on time or ahead of schedule, and then start the next batch than to start a large number of projects, take them all to 25% complete, and then sit there and thrash. One of the big Decepticons that affects, I would say, traditional organizations or organizations that have been around for many, many, many years is an inability to overcome technical constraints. A great example of that is we see it in financial services. We also see it in healthcare, where you might be dealing with some legacy applications that are your main books of record. And so it turns out that almost any new application that you will develop has to be integrated with that legacy application. The challenge being, in many cases, those legacy applications don't lend themselves to being updated regularly or frequently or early. You may not have the benefit of dedicated environments that an Agile team can access to be able to do end-to-end development and testing within their sprints. That's where we start to see the anti-pattern known as water, scrum, fall happening, where in the middle of our project, we're being agile, but as soon as we get close to the point when we're going to need to do a release, when we get into our integration testing, that's where we now revert to waterfall style phases. Another challenge that we see when looking at agile transformations is that no project is an island. Agile on a small scale works really well because we have end-to-end control over the deliverables. But when we start to scale it to a larger enterprise or to larger projects, that's where we start to cross jurisdictional boundaries. Those boundaries might be with other delivery partners within your organization. For example, maybe you're operating as part of a line of business with its own delivery staff, technology delivery staff, but you have to work with your central infrastructure group when it comes time to setting up any hardware or rolling out any applications. And if they're unwilling or incapable of supporting agile delivery, then you're dead in the water. Another source of challenge might be your control partners. When I use the term control partner, I'm talking about all the gatekeepers that are going to be standing in your way if you don't happen to meet their requirements prior to a go live. So examples of that could be your privacy folks, your compliance folks, maybe it's your technology risk and security folks. You want to make sure that their requirements have been met, but more important, that they've had a chance to see the deliverables as they're being produced and are able to say, yeah, my needs have been met. The problem is, for many organizations going through an agile transformation, the control partners have not been adequately engaged in the transformation, or they don't have the capacity to sufficiently support all the different projects that the organization would like to have delivered in an agile manner. And the final one we see is vendors. Many times what will happen is you're implementing a solution of which a component of the scope is being done through some sort of an outsourced relationship. Well, if your vendor is only used to waterfall delivery, that could be a real challenge. Do you want to invest the effort and the time maybe on their dime to bring them up to speed on agile delivery? That can be a real challenge. This is where we start to look at hybrid projects, ones where we have a certain percentage of the scope being delivered as a work stream using an agile delivery approach, and then the remaining percentage of the scope is going to be delivered as a separate work stream in more of a waterfall type manner. And the challenge with that is it's very difficult to be able to handle the orchestration that needs to go around that, as well as working through the ground rules to make sure that the agile teams and the waterfall teams are working in a consistent fashion and that the pieces that they're each working on will actually mesh together at the right time in the right way. And the final Decepticon I'll mention is around HR policies and practices. In many traditional organizations or organizations that have been using traditional delivery approaches, human resource policies and practices tend to focus on individuals. Your annual performance evaluations might be focused just on an individual. Your formal rewards plans or programs might be individual focused. Your job families might be focusing on specific competencies, developing specialists within silos. You might have a job family for business analysts and another job family for project managers. The challenge becomes, as we move to an agile delivery approach, We need to shift the granularity from the individual to the team. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't recognize people as individuals. We need to find the healthy balance is what I'm getting at. So if it turns out that you have a certain budget right now for individual rewards and recognition, maybe what it means is splitting that budget into two pieces. One that will remain focused on recognizing individuals, but a separate pool that is focused on recognizing teams for exhibiting great team dynamic and team culture. Similarly, your job families that HR will be managing need to evolve to move from specialists to generalizing specialists, folks that still have a competency, but that are versatile and flexible to be able to take on different tasks outside of their core competency. So having covered the Decepticons, what I'd like to do now is to do our next poll. Our next poll is going to be looking at the Decepticons. What I'd like to understand is, out of this list of Decepticons, for those of you that are in the midst of an Agile transformation, how many of them have affected your company's Agile transformation? Okay, looks like we have a stabilized set right now. Go ahead and end the polling and share our results. Okay, so what you could see is that the majority, unfortunately, are saying that all of these Decepticons seem to be apparent, with a few folks, probably about 50% in total, saying that they've got between 1 and 4 of these Decepticons. But no one that is going through an Agile transformation has the confidence to state that they have successfully eliminated all of them. And again, that's why we really need to consider Agile transformation as being a marathon and not a sprint, forgive the pun. Okay, so let's now start to talk about the Autobots. These are the good things, the enablers that we would like to see to have a successful Agile transformation. The first Autobot, and this would be, I would say, the Optimus Prime of Agile transformation enablers, focuses on our teams. We want to make sure that as we're setting up our teams, first we're empowering them. They should have the ability to make the majority of decisions within the team without the need to go outside. Now, when I say team, I am including the role of the product owner. So including the product owner, we should have empowerment at the team level. That will help us be more agile. Then we want our team members to have the confidence to be self-organized and to be given the authority to self-organize. Self-organization means that our focus is on the what, not the how. And within enterprise policies and standards and guidelines, beyond those, we allow teams to figure out the best way to deliver value. So as long as they're operating within enterprise policy and standards and guidelines, we should give them the flexibility to figure out the right way to deliver value for their specific project, because they're in the best position to know what makes sense for that project. We want to see a high degree of self-discipline. There's a popular myth out there that Agile means no discipline. In fact, agility requires a greater level of discipline than a traditional delivery approach. And the reason for that is very simple. We're trying to deliver value in fairly short increments of time. Might be as short as a week. A week doesn't give you a lot of wiggle room to be undisciplined and then to scramble around to try to fix the waste that you've created by being undisciplined. Whereas on a waterfall project, requirements defects might not show up till very, very late in the life cycle. On an Agile project, defects in your detailed requirements will be recognized within the same sprint that they're worked on. Another example of discipline has to do with the team having the confidence to not overcommit and underdeliver. If we've got a sponsor that walks into our team and tries to ask them to take on a new requirement in the middle of a sprint or iteration, that team needs to have the discipline to be able to try to educate that sponsor to say that they're working on a commitment of high priority work items. And while this new work item might be important, Can it wait to the start of the next sprint? And maybe there's some times when it can't. Well, if it can't, can they swap out one or two of the work items that they've got in the current sprint that they've committed to that are roughly the same size as this new item? By doing that, they have not overextended themselves. Self-awareness is extremely important. Over time, a team and the team members will start to know who's the optimist, who's the pessimist in the group, who's always kind of overcommitting and under-delivering, who's the person you go to when you're having a lot of difficulty finding out what that bug is. Self-awareness increases over time for teams. I've underlined and bolded the next couple of phrases. Long-lived. We want teams that are long-lived. The reason for that is that when you have short-lived teams, which tends to be the model on most projects, you've barely had a chance to go through your forming, storming, norming phases of Tuckman's ladder of team development. You're barely in performing for a short amount of time, and then we rip that team apart. On the other hand, when we have a long-lived team that works on maybe the same product or service or capability, release after release after release, they are in the performing phase. There's no need for them to go back through Tuckman's phases unless there's some dramatic turnover within the team. Another strong benefit of long-lived teams is they develop significant domain experience and knowledge related to the product capability or service that they are supporting and enhancing. And you also have the benefit of increased bench strength. They start to become more versatile. They can step into each other's shoes. That way, if one of them happens to be on sick or is on vacation, the other team members are able to step in and at least keep delivery going. Maybe not at the same level of productivity, but it's not a case where it's pens down, work grinds to a halt. The final adjective on this bullet is psychologically safe. This one is extremely important. Google has spent a lot of effort in trying to identify the drivers for team productivity. And the number one driver they identified was psychological safety. Psychological safety means that I can express vulnerability and I can be myself within my team. I'm able to take calculated risks, educated risks, because I know that those risks, the impact of them is fairly small if they get realized, and I know that if that risk is realized, it won't be held against me. Teams that feel psychologically safe are likely to be more creative, demonstrate a lot greater levels of innovation than teams that don't have that level of psychological safety. We want to be developing these generalizing specialists. You could use the term jack of all trades, master of one. So this doesn't mean that somebody does everything, but it means that while I might be a programmer as my main competency, I have enough familiarity and some experience with doing some analysis work, doing some testing, maybe doing some technical documentation, and more important, that I've got the flexibility that if my team realizes that what's best for the team is for me at this point in time to put aside my primary competency and help out, pitch in and help out in some other way, I'm willing to do that. I'm not going to stand up and say, that's not my job. That's what we want to develop, generalizing specialists. I'd spoken a bit about the behavior and mindset changes that are required. These are critical, and they're required at every level of the organization, from your senior leadership team down to your frontline staff working on projects or in operations. To help that mindset and behavior stick, what we need is sufficient coaching support. It's not enough to get an agile coach for one of your project teams if the sponsor or key senior stakeholders are not thinking in an agile manner. We need coaching for those leaders as well. We need to have sufficient coaching support until we see those behavioral changes are sticking, that people have now developed that muscle memory. The flip side of that Decepticon I had illustrated on the previous slide was that we want our HR policies and practices aligned with agile delivery. What this means is that when it comes time to do our annual performance evaluations, we need to have a mandatory component of those evaluations being some sort of a 360-degree vehicle, some method of being able to get team-level feedback as to how did this individual work as part of the team. Too often what we're seeing is people managers are basically evaluating their staff without reaching out to the peers of that individual. And that's where sometimes we see the focus is too much on results and not on how those results were achieved. And another mirror to what we had on the previous slide, we want to make sure that for all of the projects in our portfolio that we believe could be better delivered in an agile manner, that we have got engagement from our key delivery and control partners, and that when we're looking at procurement relationships with vendors, maybe putting together those vendors of record, that we're aligning with vendors that have a similar delivery approach to ours. And the final one I would say is we want to move away from multitasking. While it's true that there's likely going to be some roles on an agile project that don't need to be there 100% of the time. For example, I might have some sort of an application development project where I need a database administrator for a few of the work items in the backlog. Maybe they don't need to be there for every sprint. But when we look at our core primary roles, our product owner, our scrum master or agile lead, our developers, our testers, our analysts, our change folks, those need to be dedicated. Otherwise, we're going to be in a situation where we cannot utilize the forecasting abilities of velocity and the size of your backlog, and we run the risk of information gaps leading to increased delivery times and defects. So let's shift focus now and talk a little bit about agile scaling frameworks. If you're looking to take Agile from an individual project or a few projects up to more of a departmental or an enterprise level, you really want to look at a scaling framework. The very simplest approach is what's known as a Scrum of Scrums. The Scrum of Scrums applies when you're dealing with large projects or programs that are comprised of multiple Agile teams working together in a coordinated fashion. The Scrum of Scrums is a ceremony where once the daily stand-ups or scrums of each of your Agile teams have been completed, a separate ceremony is run where an ambassador or a delegate from each of your Agile teams will get together with his or her counterparts from the other Agile teams, and they will go through a very similar dialogue to what is seen in a normal daily stand-up. So it's an opportunity to coordinate at a slightly higher level what is going to be happening for that day and to surface the blockers that might be standing in the path of multiple Agile teams working on a program or a large project. When we start to look at portfolios of project, that's where we need to start looking at some of the actual scaling frameworks. And there's 4 that are out there. There's probably more, but these are the 4 that tend to be referenced the most. The one that tends to have the greatest mind share and market share right now is SAFE from Scale and Agile Inc. LESS is another one. Nexus is another one. The 3 of them tend to be very well focused on product style delivery. So product versus project, very focused on product delivery. And all 3 of them do have a strong connection to the Scrum methodology. On the other hand, you could look at Disciplined Agile, which comes from the Disciplined Agile Consortium. One benefit of Disciplined Agile is that it is applicable on non-technology projects. It can be utilized for non-technology projects, and it is not tied to any one specific Agile methodology. So if your organization has not actually adopted Scrum down at the team level, then Disciplined Agile does not mandate or enforce the need to adopt that nomenclature. Disciplined Agile provides a framework to enable process decision making. I can have a waterfall type project that I configure and utilize and align with Disciplined Agile, and I can have a full Agile project that I go through the same steps on. It is a framework that supports that continuum from traditional delivery to Agile delivery. So what's important is to recognize that all of these frameworks, if you scratch the covers, underneath those covers you have the standard Agile values and principles, but They do differ based on the amount to which they would enforce your organization to adopt specific terminology and specific practices. Finally, how do we get started with an agile transformation? First, it's important to note you will not succeed just top-down or just bottom-up. You need the top-down support because an agile transformation isn't cheap. You also want to ensure that the very highest levels of your organization are exhibiting the right behaviors and mindset. So we need that top-down commitment. But we also need the bottom-up commitment. We need teams, team members that understand or that are aching for a better way to deliver value to their customers. If you don't have that buy-in from the bottom, from the grassroots, then just top-down won't work. On the other hand, trying to do an agile transformation as a grassroots movement is doomed to failure. There's just too much weight of legacy thinking that has to be moved to be able to get the momentum you need for a successful agile transformation. So top-down and bottom-up in parallel are required. Having said that, though, I recommend start small and build up. It's never a good idea to start with the most critical project in your organization's portfolio. Sure, you might get great visibility. You might even have a really good budget for it. But on the other hand, if for some reason it fails, or if maybe it's not as much of a success as you hoped for, that could be a real challenge. And on top of that, what we need to recognize is any change in delivery practices, the first 1 or 2 times kicking that can, you will see somewhat of a reduction in productivity. It's true of any change. Until people are comfortable working in a new way, there is going to be some waste that is incurred with them being taught and learning and practicing. So I recommend start small. Pick a few small projects, a handful at most, that where you've got team members that are enthused, that are highly energized about trying this out, where you have sponsors that are exhibiting the right types of behaviors, where maybe you're not having to cross multiple organizational boundaries. Learn lessons from those projects and build up slowly over time. It's important to get trained. While there's a tremendous amount of material available on the internet about Agile, there's also a tremendous amount of misconception and misdirection. I would strongly recommend methodology agnostic Agile training. Until your organization has learned enough to decide what methodology makes the most sense, fits the best, if you will, it's better to be methodology agnostic. Get the values and principles indoctrinated first, then move on to methodology. Get support for your Agile transformation from legitimate consultants and coaches. Unfortunately, there's a lot of hype out there. Agile has become the new snake oil. There's a lot of people that have gone through a 2-day course and written their CSM exam and that are claiming to be Agile consultants and coaches. Make sure you can validate with some independent references the work that these folks have done. And be realistic. Recognize Rome wasn't built in a day. It will take a while to move from decades of traditional delivery and, more importantly, decades of traditional thinking to an agile delivery approach. Large organizations, you could be talking about a journey of 5 years or longer before you really start to see the full value of Agile. You'll probably see some value at the end of your first year, but really to start reaping the rewards, you're going to have to be it for the long haul. Just remember, it's a journey, not a destination. So let's all keep calm and roll out, as Optimus Prime would say.
We can now go to the questions. We have 3 questions. I'll read them out and then I'll give the hard part to Kieran to actually answer them. The first question is from Jordan Max. Jordan asks, what would you think about a compromise whereby we start piloting some test projects using Agile to demonstrate the value of Agile rather than waiting for the mindset to be cemented?
Sure, that's a great question, Jordan. I mean, I think I can totally see where you're coming from. The challenge is mindset and behavior by itself doesn't necessarily deliver value. And so if you're investing in, let's say, coaching resources with green dollars, you'd like to be able to get some value for that in the near term. What I'm actually suggesting with the mindset and behavior is that if your organization, let's say whoever was your main champion for your agile transformation, knew that within the next year they want to kick it off, that's really where you could start to work on the behavior and mindset. In fact, I've always said that it would be amazing if you could actually have an organization that had traditional waterfall delivery where they actually just focused on an agile mindset. So continue to deliver in a traditional manner, but adopt an agile mindset. Once that mindset is in place, then it's much easier a year, 2 years down the line to introduce then a shift in delivery methodology. But I totally get where you're coming from. My main recommendation would be don't neglect the mindset and behavior. So if you want to do it in parallel, that's fine. Just don't take that approach of saying we're gonna get out of the gates with a bunch of practices and tools focused on whether it's a few teams or multiple teams, but neglect that behavior and mindset, because that's where it will catch up with you in the long run. Hope that answers the question, Jordan.
Great. Our next question is from Sangram, and Sangram asks, what are the best ways to justify or prove the return on investment if it takes up to 2 years to change the mindset before we can start seeing the benefits of Agile?
Sure, that's a great question. And this is where, while Agile, I would say subjectively, there's a lot of good feedback around it. There's a lot of thought that it is delivering results better than a traditional approach. There isn't a lot of empirical evidence. There's not a lot of hard data. And the reality is data that you might see from a different industry or from a different geography, how relevant is it to your organization? So what I would recommend actually doing is, if you're thinking about an agile transformation, start to get your baseline data now. The benefit of that will be if you start to capture things such as what is your time to market? What percentage of the features that your traditional teams are delivering are actually being utilized by your customers? If you start to gather those sorts of virtual metrics or valuable metrics rather, or virtuous metrics if you will now, then when we get a year down the line, 2 years down the line, and you've had a few teams that have started to deliver in an agile manner, you now have that ability to compare your target state with what your baseline was. But if you find yourself having those teams running and you don't have good baseline data, then you've got a challenge. There have been a few studies that have been done. Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago did publish a paper that talked about the improvements that we're seeing in organizations that have moved to an agile delivery approach. There was actually a journal that was produced in 2004, or a research article in 2004, published in, I believe, PM Journal, where the two researchers did find that there was a correlation between the use of an agile approach and a higher level of project success. And how they defined success was meeting stakeholder expectations and delivering within the iron triangle, the scope, schedule, cost constraints. So there does appear to be some data, but at the end of the day, is that data really relevant for your organization? The best way to know that is establish a baseline and measure against it.
Excellent. Our next question is from Allison. Allison asks, do you have any concrete suggestions for tackling the mindset?
Sure. So I think that's where the coaching is really the best way to do it. And it can be peer level coaching. It could be coaching from the outside. Usually to have an agile transformation, you're going to have somebody, if you're doing it top down, somebody that at the leadership table already has that mindset, already has the right behaviors. Now it's how do we provide that individual with the influence and the power they need to sort of infect all of their peers to be thinking the same way. If nobody at the senior leadership table has that behavior and mindset ingrained, that's a real challenge then. Now you've got that situation where maybe as a mid-level manager, you've got to try to bring in somebody from the outside or do a lot of upselling to try to get that mindset to stick. But hopefully there's somebody at the C level that's already thinking the right way. Now it's how do we go about enabling them to be able to spread that gospel, if you will, across their team of senior leaders. And one way to do that is with external coaching. That can certainly help. There is a price to it. And the key is, how do you sell that? Well, you sell it based on some I would say, some tangible benefits that you hope to derive. Higher levels of employee engagement, perhaps. or maybe faster delivery, whatever the case might be, less defects, you do need to figure out what is the lever to get that C-level executive table to be able to sit up and say, yeah, we need to actually think about this a different way. That is a challenge. It is tricky, but without doing that, if we only focus on the practices and the tools, we're not going to get there. The good news, though, is that Agile has now been around for so long that it's pretty hard to find any company where they haven't heard about it, and you're getting a lot of the executives at companies saying, how can we be more agile? So now the question is, if they've got that sense of urgency or they've got that appetite, it's helping them prioritize the mindset and the behavior over the practices and tools. And again, that's where the coaching, that's where bringing somebody in from the outside that can point to the difference between doing it one way, the Decepticon way, versus the Autobot way can make the difference.
Great. Our next question is now from Susan. Susan asks, can you recommend courses for senior leadership to help them better understand Agile?
Yeah, so that's something where, I mean, we're going to be certainly broadening our Agile curriculum at World Class Productivity, but outside of that, what I would say is you do need to look at executive level courses for Agile, and unfortunately, if you kind of do a quick search on Google, what you'll find is the majority of courses tend to be aimed at practitioners. This is really where I find that as opposed to sending executives on a course, sometimes it's better to bring that coach in-house to use Agile simulations. There's a great game I used to use at my last employer, which we call the Lego game. It had a team of executives going through 3 sprints, creating simple widgets in Lego, but it gave them that opportunity to see the difference in delivering in an agile manner versus a traditional manner. If they've gone through that and they have somebody that can speak with credibility, sometimes that's better than sending them out on a course. It doesn't necessarily stick as well as if it's in-house brought to bear.
We do have 3 more questions, and we'll address them. For those that do have somewhere to be at 3 o'clock, I want to thank you for participating. For those that would like to stick around just a few more minutes, we will happily address the 3 remaining questions, and any additional questions you have, don't hesitate to contact either Kieran directly or contact WSP in general using info@wspconsulting.com. We'd be happy to address any of your questions. The next question we do have is from Jill. Jill asks, do organizations eventually become successful with Agile even if they had a bad start, or it is typically abandoned?
So again, I think that really comes down to the leadership drive and also just how badly the early failures are. I've seen organizations where they've gone through waves where Agile rears its head sort of once every few years. They make a half-hearted attempt to be Agile, then they abandon it. And by the time they start to think about it again, there's been sort of a new stream or a new slew of leaders have joined, and there's that sort of amnesia has set in, so they forget the lessons from the past. What I have seen, though, is organizations where you have a critical mass of folks that are really committed to it, that say, you know, yeah, we're going to struggle, we're going to fail, let's dust ourselves off and let's learn from those mistakes. Those are the ones that succeed. So I think, and that's really why I go back to, it's good to start small. Once you start to look at actually leveraging Agile principles and practices on projects, start with some small, I would say, lower risk ones. Those are the ones that if, let's say, the first project or 2 doesn't really work out great, no harm, no foul. You've learned some valuable lessons. Hopefully you can leverage those on the next project. If you start with sort of a sink the company type project, that might leave such a bad taste in people's mouths that you'll never recover from it. It's also really important that there's a good change in communication plan around your Agile transformation. People need to understand that it's a new way of thinking, it's a new way of working. It's not going to be easy right away. And if you don't have that sort of change and communication support, it can feel like it's being rammed down people's throats. And again, that leaves a bad taste in people's mouths that might last significantly longer than the end of your first Agile transformation, and it might actually prevent you from ever having a successful one. So again, I think some good change management principles applied and having some sustained support and leadership can help to have you eventually succeed if maybe the first attempt was not that successful.
Great. We have 2 more questions. Kobe asks, can you provide an example of what an Agile mindset would look like in a waterfall setting? How does this differ from standard PMBOK best practices?
Sure, and that's actually an amazing point that you raised. That PMBOK best practices will absolutely talk about things that will fall very well within an agile mindset. The challenge becomes, though, that in a traditional organization with traditional delivery, sometimes they've moved themselves into that command and control model where they're not trusting the team members, where project managers are asking for daily status updates, where project managers are being put on the spot to create these ridiculous 15 outline level Gantt charts down to the individual day or half day of detail. That's what I mean by a theory X or a traditional mindset. I can still run a waterfall project where I am going to do all my requirements work up front and deliver the project in a phased manner, but I can apply that servant leadership approach. I can apply certain agile principles and practices. I can have my business people, my customers, working very closely with us, sitting down with us every day to make sure that as we're determining the requirements baseline, that we're not off track. As we're going through design, that their minds haven't changed yet. As we're going through development, we're still showing them as we're going along. We can be using the concept of retrospectives in a traditional waterfall type project. Instead of doing lessons learned at the end, we can start to do that earlier. But the mindset, really what I focus on there is things like the empowerment, servant leadership, the willingness to let teams self-organize. You can see that on a waterfall project as well. And you're absolutely correct that good project managers will exhibit those behaviors even if they're on a traditional project. The challenge is the environment they're operating in may not allow them to do so.
Our final question is from Siva. Siva asks, can you share some lessons learned for the resources spread across on-site and offshore model setups for agile projects?
Great question. So when we look at teams that are not co-located and when we start to think about multiple time zones being in play, that's where we need to be strategic about how we're splitting the work. If we're in a situation where we can collaborate because of leveraging technologies, let's say using an online information repository, instant messaging, video conferencing, and if the time zones aren't too far apart, then you could still operate in an agile manner as a single agile team. If it turns out, though, on the other hand, the time zones are too far apart, or you don't have those enabling technologies, that's where you might need to start to look at actually dividing the work up and having maybe parallel streams of sprints. For example, in many organizations, they have unfortunately outsourced testing. And that testing might be done 10 hours time difference. Well, you could try to make that work within a single team within the same sprint. But what many organizations do is that then they will take the work that those testing teams are doing and they'll turn it into a separate delivery stream. So we have one agile team that's doing development and unit testing, and then they hand the work off to the team that is going to do the testing. It's not optimal, but sometimes that's better than trying to get the cohesive communication flow when you're split by that much of a time zone difference, especially when you don't have those technologies to leverage.
Great, Kieran. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Once again, if anybody has any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're always happy to help, and make sure you keep posted for future webinars that we'll be offering this series. With that, I'd like to end this session. Thank you again, and good luck with all your traditional as well as agile projects.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.